We absolutely know, without any question, to me at least, that why in the world is an 18-year-old buying an assault weapon? You know, a 21-year-old, I'd welcome it. But really and truly, we know all of the stuff that's going on social media all across the land. We know of the profanity. We know of absolutely all the different stuff, you know, all the porn, all the bad stuff that's out there that is getting in the minds of our children. We know all these violent video games that are out there getting in the minds of our children. Why don't we do something about it?
So that is Governor Jim Justice. And what he just said there is what passes these days for a hopeful development when it comes to gun control, because despite the fact that most of that video is him talking about a whole bunch of nonsense that he seems to be indicating is responsible for gun violence, including things like pornography and video games and, you know, all of these things that every other country on the planet has. What they don't have is the shootings, things that by the very nature of how reality works can't be responsible because they don't cause those things anywhere else than the United States. All of that aside, and we will dive into that, he indicated potentially being supportive of raising the age to be able to buy an assault weapon from 18, which he thinks is objectively wrong, to 21, where he would welcome it. I would have a follow-up question. Why? Why would you be excited about that? What is the massive difference between 18 and 21? I get it, that's the debate that we're having as a nation. But in any event, Adrienne, he at least seems supportive of making the sort of change that, in the case of the Uvalde shooting, would have stopped this event from happening, or at the very least would have stopped it from being anywhere near as deadly as it was.
Yeah, and the thing is like, I really do want to discuss all the potential options for how to curb this, but I think it's pretty disingenuous not to simply acknowledge and admit that eliminating these assault rifles and removing them from the streets is an easy way to prevent these kind of things from happening. And so dancing around this age requirement and even suggesting moving it to 21 or not, it's like, it's all cute and it seems all good, but it's not actually going to be truly effective, because there's definitely seems to be a pattern when it comes to a lot of these mass shootings, especially when they are involving children and other youth. But at the same time, the gun is the one consistent thing, no matter what that pattern shows.
Exactly. Yeah. You could be obsessed with pornography. You could spend every day hours and hours on porn or playing Elden Ring. You could be obsessed with all the things you just talked about. You are not going to be able to just manifest massive amounts of brutal death. The gun is an important component of that, but of course they're not interested in banning it. But like I said, we're looking for good news in the real world. So there's a bit of good news for you. Here is maybe a bit of good news. Another Republican governor of Arkansas, Governor Hutchinson, said he's open to having a conversation on raising the minimum age requirements, specifically for AR-15 style weapons. Adam Kinzinger said that he's open for a federal ban on those rifles, as well as raising the age requirements. Of course, a governor being in support of it is very different than, you know, the least popular Republican congressman being in support of it. And in Congress, theoretically, these things would pass without Republicans being needed, in the House at least. So maybe a couple places at the state level, the governor wouldn't veto it. That is not the same thing as the Republican legislatures of those states being willing to put those things forward. So again, who knows if even in these areas it'll happen, but we did briefly talk, it had happened, we found out about it live on the show yesterday, that New York is going to be raising the age to buy an assault rifle to 21, as well as banning body armor. Bill's gonna prohibit not only the body armor, but also require a license to purchase a semi-automatic rifle, make threatening mass harm a crime. I guess it wasn't. Strengthen the state's red flag laws. The measure would also require new pistols to be equipped with micro-stamping technology, which uses lasers to imprint markings on a firearm to make it easier to trace guns to registered owners. That's the sort of very reasonable stuff that the NRA is always against. The bill would raise the age to buy assault rifles to bring New York in line with states like Illinois, Washington, Hawaii, and Florida. So that's, I think, most of the good news. Maybe there's other stuff that you can cite, Adrienne, but that's the good news that I've found. Or at least hopeful news.
And the thing is, again, it is somewhat hopeful without a doubt, but still it's a problem that we even have these firearms. It's so incredibly sad that the GOP let the ban on these assault weapons lapse, because now people feel they're entitled to it. People have them and they feel like they should continue to have them. And so we're going to continue to bump these restrictions in these very almost meaningless ways that aren't going to truly address the issue of mass shootings. Also, too, just moving up that age requirement doesn't mean that people aren't still going to access guns. Lord knows you have alcohol, access set at 21, but Lord knows we've been accessing that since probably like early teens. So it's not going to necessarily change the game, but it's cute. It's just not effective.
Exactly. Yeah. I wish that we had more. I wish that we could have higher hopes. And I know, some people last week were like, oh, maybe an opening. And I was being a killjoy and everything. And again, it's not to say that nothing is changing. I mean, after all, like New York did pass that, bringing New York's gun laws into line with what I considered the bare minimum of what I already thought New York did. Apparently, they weren't great in those areas. But anyway, that's what we've got. There were big promises made initially. Joe Biden saying, we can do this. I mean, not me, I'm powerless, I can't do anything, but somebody surely can do this, especially because we've got reasonable Republicans that we can work with. And I have done everything I can to track down the reasonable Republicans. I've given credit to people like Jim Justice and Governor Hutchinson, but two of the people that he cited, one was Mitch McConnell, reasonable Republican. McConnell apparently told Manu Raju, it seems to me there are two broad categories that underscore the problem: mental illness and school safety. So that's what this bipartisan group supposedly is going to work on, is mental illness and school safety. You'll notice what's missing from that. The other reasonable Republican, of course, was John Cornyn of Texas, who responded to a tweet about the possibility that Cornyn would support literally any gun control whatsoever, to which John Cornyn said, not gonna happen. So those are the two individuals that Joe Biden is like, no, there are still good Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who called himself the Grim Reaper of Congress, and John Cornyn, Big John himself, who believes that guns are the single most important thing in America, Adrienne. Those are the ones that Biden would have us believe are gonna cross over and do the reasonable thing.
Yeah, I'm really tired of Biden's thought that everyone is going to be reasonable, that they can all work together, reach your hand across the aisle. The reality is that it's shown time and time again that he's dealing with an entirely new GOP. It shows you that Biden is completely and totally out of touch, that all of the gentlemen's agreements from the past, they dissipated. They are absolutely gone post-Trump. And so you actually have to take your gloves off and get in this. And it'd be nice to have a president who is truly invested enough to be hip to the game and stop wishing these were the good old days.
Yeah, and look, there's people. So Mac Bain is pointing out, I think, a good point, saying that in theory you can pass these sorts of state level laws, but as with Rittenhouse, we can see that a different state having worse laws could still result in gun violence in your place, and that is totally true. That said, still do it. Like, raising the age isn't necessarily going to stop them. Making them, like, none of these things are necessarily singularly going to stop any particular act of violence, let alone all acts of violence. But we have got to do something, and I would say as many things as we can do that seem like they might actually be related to the violence. I'm not talking about like banning pornography like JP Mandel. Is that his name? JP Vance. I get it now. Trump has incepted me and I don't know their names anymore. That is not actually going to help, and they don't want to do it. They're just wasting our time. But any of these laws that we can pass that would help, I think, is a good thing to move into. Now that said, let's move to what one particular state wants to do. Governor Greg Abbott has been under a lot of pressure on the topic of guns ever since last week's devastating shooting in Uvalde, and people are angry at him for willingly or unknowingly spreading misinformation about the shooting in the wake of it. And in the lead up to that shooting, cutting funding for mental health services, opening up Texas's gun laws, seeming to be perfectly fine with creating an environment where anyone can get massively deadly weapons if they want to. Well, now he is saying he does want to do something to stop future school shootings. The issue is with what he wants to focus on and what he doesn't. He sent a letter to people he's going to work with in the state legislature, saying that they do want to prevent these shootings, but gun control is not on the list of things that he wants to focus on. In fact, let's go ahead to a screenshot from his actual letter. He wants to do a special legislative session to focus on school safety, mental health, social media, police training, and firearm safety. Now, look, me as the little bit of optimism I still have would say, well, wouldn't a part of gun safety being not letting people who won't be safe with those guns buy them? but that is not what they mean there, Adrienne. So it's gonna be on making sure that the police are more brave in the future. And then, I don't know, school safety, I guess that's fewer doors or something. None of the stuff that we know would actually contribute to fewer mass shootings.
No, exactly. And also things that haven't been shown to necessarily be effective, like the police. Like how much funding needs to go to them for them to get it right? Knowing that 40% of Uvalde's municipal budget was going to police, and we saw what they did in that moment when they were needed and they were armed, equipped, and they had all the knowledge and all the technology, everything they needed to execute, and it did not get done. So let's stop throwing our money down a well and let's just address the issue, which may mean gun manufacturers make less money, but it also means fewer of us die. And that sounds kind of cool.
It does 100%. And yeah, you're right to focus on like how much more funding, but that is what they're gonna do. This is going to result in more funding. There is nothing that happens with guns, whether it's discussion of gun control or mass shootings, that doesn't result in more gun sales. And there's nothing that can happen in terms of the mass shootings that isn't going to result in more funding going to the police. And that was what I was saying all over the last week. It's one of the reasons I didn't like that we were focusing so much on the fact that the police had both failed and lied. It made sense to, we had to, but it also meant that the conversation was about, well, if only the police had done better, and thus some people will believe, oh, then let's have them do better. But that isn't the solution to the problem. They'll get more money for training. They've already been training for these exact situations. Specifically in Uvalde, they had been trained. The documents were clear about what they were supposed to do. They just didn't do those things. And more funding, more sessions, that is not the solution. The solution is not having kids running around with AR-15s. But that is what they're going to focus on. If they do anything in Texas, it is not going to be anything that stops the next potential school shooter from just walking in and buying an AR-15. And we can only hope that once they do that, there's not enough doors for them to get into the school.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.